You open Instagram. You scroll for a few minutes, you double tap a few photos, maybe leave a comment, maybe share something to your story, and then you put your phone down and move on with your life. Now think about someone you know who doesn't do any of that. Not because they don't have the apps, not because they don't know how. They just don't post. Their profile, if they even have one, is a ghost town. Maybe a profile picture from 3 years ago, a handful of photos they uploaded once and never touched again, and a following count that hasn't moved in months. They scroll through your content, they see everything, but they leave no trace of themselves. No stories, no opinions, no updates. You might have assumed they're shy, or antisocial, or maybe just not into social media. But here's the thing. When you actually spend time with these people, they're often some of the most thoughtful, perceptive, and emotionally intelligent people you've ever met. They notice things others miss. They listen in ways most people don't. And they have rich, full inner lives that simply never make it to a screen. So what's actually going on inside the mind of someone who watches but never posts, who observes but never performs? Is it fear? Is it wisdom? Is it something they were born with, or something that was slowly shaped by the way the world treated them? The answer is far more layered than most people realize. Here's what most people assume about people who don't post. They must be missing out. In a world where visibility equals opportunity, where personal branding is treated like currency, where if it isn't documented, it didn't happen has become an unspoken social rule, choosing silence seems like a disadvantage. People see them as passive, as invisible, as somehow less engaged with the world. But here's where the story flips. Research in social psychology consistently shows that the act of sharing experiences publicly, the very thing we celebrate as connection, often diminishes the depth of the experience itself. A phenomenon called social sharing distortion suggests that when we frame our lives for an audience, we begin to live for the frame rather than for the feeling. We edit our grief to be more palatable. We perform our joy to be more shareable. Over time, the distance between what we experience and what we express grows wider, and we stop noticing. The people who don't post, they haven't opted out of life. In many cases, they've opted out of that distortion. But it comes with its own weight, because in a world that measures presence through posting, choosing not to perform yourself publicly can feel like slowly becoming invisible, not to others, but to yourself. When your joys don't get likes, your achievements don't get announced, and your struggles aren't validated by comment threads, something quietly strange begins to happen. You start to wonder, does this still count if no one saw it? That question, small, seemingly harmless, is the beginning of a very deep psychological story. And to understand where it leads, we first need to understand where it starts. Psychology generally divides the tendency towards social media silence into two broad origins, and most people who don't post fall somewhere on the spectrum between them, or carry elements of both at once. The first is temperamental. Some people are simply wired from birth to process the world inward rather than outward. In neuroscience, this is connected to differences in dopamine sensitivity and the brain's reward circuitry. For most people, public recognition, a like, a comment, a share, triggers a measurable dopamine release. The brain files it as reward and the behavior gets reinforced. But for a significant subset of people, that same external validation doesn't register with the same intensity. It's not that it feels bad, it just doesn't feel like much. And because the reward isn't powerful enough to sustain the behavior quietly fades. These people aren't broken.
They're simply running on a different reward system, one that responds more to internal satisfaction than external feedback. Think of them as people whose batteries recharge in private, not in public. The second origin is formed. It's built from experience, from environment, from the specific emotional weather of their childhood and early relationships. If you grew up in a household where your emotions were dismissed, minimized, or treated as inconvenient, you learned very early that sharing yourself openly was a risk that rarely paid off. You learned to hold things inward not because you wanted to, but because it was safer. Social media, with its brutal combination of public visibility and unpredictable reception, becomes an extension of that original wound. To post is to be seen, and to be seen, somewhere deep in the architecture of their nervous system, still feels dangerous, even if they can't explain why. There's also a third, quieter layer that doesn't fit neatly into either category: social observation preference, a term used in psychology to describe people who genuinely derive more satisfaction from watching and understanding than from participating and being observed. These aren't shy people. They're not afraid. They're more like naturalists. They find the act of watching the world deeply interesting, and they've never particularly needed to be watched in return. Whatever the origin, wired, formed, or simply shaped by preference, one thing is true across all of them. You are not broken. You are simply carrying a different relationship to visibility than the world around you was designed to reward. So how does this psychology actually show up in everyday life? Not in dramatic, obvious ways, but in the quiet, specific, almost invisible patterns that you might recognize if you pay close enough attention. Sign 1. The unlocked moment. There's a concept in positive psychology called savoring, the deliberate practice of fully absorbing a pleasurable experience without trying to extend, share, or preserve it. Research by Fred Bryant at Loyola University found that people who savor experiences without immediately translating them into shareable content report higher overall life satisfaction than those who don't. People who don't post are often natural savorers. When something beautiful happens, a sunset, a meal, a moment of connection, their first instinct isn't to reach for their phone. It's to go still, to let the thing land. And the result is a quality of presence that people around them often find quietly striking, even if they can't name what's different about it. But the cost is subtle. Because these moments leave no external record, they can begin to feel private to the point of loneliness. Joy that isn't witnessed can start to feel like joy that never fully existed. Sign 2. The performer's paradox. Ask someone who doesn't post to imagine writing a caption for a photo of themselves and watch what happens in their face. There's often a specific kind of discomfort, not embarrassment exactly, but something closer to what psychologists call self-objectification discomfort, the unease that comes from being asked to view yourself from the outside and curate that view for others. For most people, this discomfort is mild and quickly overridden by the social incentives of posting. But for people who don't post, it tends to be sharper, more persistent. They find something faintly absurd, even slightly dishonest, in the act of composing a public image of themselves. It's not that they think they're better than the people who do it, it's more that the whole exercise feels like wearing a costume that doesn't quite fit. They can do it, technically, they just can't do it without feeling like they're performing something that isn't entirely real, and that feeling for them is a deal breaker. Sign 3. The memory keeper. Here's something interesting. People who don't document their lives publicly often have unusually rich private archives, journals, photo collections that exist only on their own phone, notes to self, voice memos they recorded in the middle of the night. They're not uninterested in preserving memory, they're deeply interested. They just prefer to preserve it for themselves rather than for an audience. This connects to what psychologists call autobiographical memory preference, the tendency to encode life experiences as deeply personal narratives rather than public performances. The internal archive is more detailed, more emotionally textured, and in some ways more honest than anything that would survive the editing process of a public post. But it also creates a particular kind of loneliness, a life that is fully felt and deeply recorded, but almost entirely invisible to the people around them. Sign 4. The Hyperaware Observer. In any group setting, there's usually one person who seems to be quietly processing everything, who notices the slight change in someone's tone, who picks up on the tension in a room before anyone else does, who remembers details from conversations 3 months ago with unsettling precision. This is very often the person who doesn't post. The psychology here is connected to what researchers call social observation bias, a tendency that develops when someone spends more time watching social dynamics than participating in them. Over time, their ability to read people, detect patterns, and anticipate behavior becomes unusually refined. It's a genuine cognitive advantage.
but it also means they're constantly processing far more information than most people carry, and that processing comes with a cost, a low-grade mental exhaustion that's hard to explain to anyone who doesn't experience it. It's not social anxiety, it's more like being a translator who can't turn off the translation. Sign 5. The validation paradox. One of the most counterintuitive things about people who don't post is that their relationship to validation is not simpler than everyone else's, it's more complicated. They aren't indifferent to being seen. In fact, many of them want very deeply to be known. What they resist is being known shallowly, to have someone see a curated fragment of their life and feel like they understand them. This connects to a concept in humanistic psychology called the need for authentic recognition, the desire not just to be approved of, but to be understood accurately by someone who has access to your actual self, not your edited highlights. The painful irony is that by refusing to post, they often end up known less, not more. The platform where most people perform their depth becomes the platform where their depth stays invisible. And so they exist in a quiet bind, wanting to be known, but unwilling to be known badly, which sometimes means not being known at all. Sign 6. The asymmetry of giving. People who don't post are often remarkably generous with their attention toward others. They'll spend real time reading what you wrote, thinking about it, sometimes returning to it days later with a response that's unexpectedly precise. They remember things you shared in passing. They show up, often without announcement, in exactly the way you needed them. But they rarely ask for the same in return. Not because they don't need it, but because asking for attention, making themselves the subject, runs against every instinct they've developed. This creates a persistent asymmetry in their relationships. They give depth and receive surface. They offer attention and rarely ask it back. They know others well and often feel only partially known themselves. Over time, this imbalance doesn't feel like a deficit to them. It just quietly becomes the shape of most of their relationships. Sign 8. The quiet contempt that they try to hide. This one is uncomfortable, but it's real. Some people who don't post carry a subtle, mostly unspoken judgment toward people who post frequently. It's not always conscious, but it surfaces in small ways. A faint eye roll at someone's travel content, a slight impatience with people who seem to need external validation, a private sense of superiority about their own relationship to authenticity. Psychologists call this compensatory contempt, a defense mechanism where we develop disdain for the very thing we're unconsciously ambivalent about. Because if you're being fully honest, and this is the part most people who don't post would rather not look at, the contempt sometimes isn't really about other people's shallowness. It's about managing your own discomfort with wanting what they have, what ease they seem to feel in being seen, without being willing to pay the price you perceive as the price. Sign 9. The comfort in controlled invisibility. There's a specific kind of relief that people who don't post describe, often in very similar terms when you ask them about it. The relief of not being tracked, of not having a searchable public record of who they were 3 years ago, of being able to change quietly without having to reconcile the new version of themselves with the old one that's preserved in someone else's feed. This connects to what humanistic psychologists call narrative flexibility, the psychological freedom to rewrite your own story without the constraint of an externally imposed archive. People who post heavily often find themselves subtly shaped by their own public narrative. They continue to be the person their audience expects them to be, even when that person no longer fits. People who don't post don't have that constraint. They can change without announcement. They can outgrow things privately. There's a lightness to that, and also, sometimes, a loneliness. When these patterns continue for long enough, and when the world keeps responding to absence with the assumption of withdrawal, something deeper begins to happen inside the mind of someone who doesn't post. The brain, which is fundamentally a social organ shaped by millions of years of needing the tribe to survive, begins to run a quiet calculation. It notices that the social feedback loops that other people rely on, the likes, the comments, the shared responses, are consistently absent. And because the brain interprets social absence as social risk, it starts to compensate, not by pushing the person to post, but by sharpening other social sensors to compensate for the missing feedback. The result is a particular kind of hypervigilance, not anxious, not paranoid, but finely tuned, a tendency to read meaning into small signals, to feel deeply attuned to the emotional states of people nearby, even when those people aren't communicating anything obvious, to live in a state of quiet, continuous social awareness that most people simply aren't operating at. This is genuinely adaptive. It's a cognitive strategy that works, but over time it tends to produce a very specific emotional experience, the feeling of being deeply present to the world while simultaneously feeling at a slight remove from it, close to everything, fully inside nothing, witnessing life at very high resolution while somehow feeling like the frame itself is missing. Psychologists have begun to describe this as spectatorship syndrome, not a diagnosis but a pattern, where someone develops such a sophisticated relationship to observing their own life and others that they find it increasingly difficult to simply inhabit the moment without simultaneously watching it.
They become, in some sense, both the person in the scene and the camera recording it. And the loneliness that comes with this isn't the obvious kind. It's not the loneliness of having no one around. It's the loneliness of being present in rooms full of people and still feeling somehow that the deepest version of you hasn't been introduced yet. You cannot simply decide to care less about authenticity. You cannot choose to find shallow recognition satisfying when it genuinely isn't. The answer is not becoming less of yourself, less observant, less interior, less precise about what feels real versus what feels performed. The answer is something more nuanced than that. The first shift is in how you understand your own silence. There's a meaningful difference between silence as self-protection and silence as preference. Many people who don't post have spent years experiencing their non-posting as a kind of social failure, as proof of their inability to belong, to be comfortable with visibility, to do the thing that everyone else seems to do naturally. But reframing the silence as a legitimate mode of being, as a genuine psychological style rather than a deficit, changes the internal experience of it dramatically. You are not failing to post. You're choosing, in a considered way, to relate to your own life differently than the dominant culture currently recommends. That is a position you can stand in with dignity rather than one you explain apologetically. The second shift is in how you allow yourself to be known. The bind that most non-posters find themselves in, wanting deep recognition but resisting shallow exposure, doesn't have to be solved by posting more. It can be solved by investing more deliberately in the spaces where depth is possible. One honest conversation with someone who is genuinely curious about you will do more for the loneliness than 100 posts ever could. The platform isn't the only place to be seen, it's just the loudest. And the loudest place is often the worst place for people who communicate best in something closer to silence. What this means practically, lean into the relationships that already allow you to exist at full depth. Reciprocate the curiosity you show so generously toward others. Let people know you in the ways you're actually comfortable with, not as a performance, but as a gradual, chosen act of trust. The goal isn't to make yourself visible to everyone, it's to make yourself visible to the right people in ways that feel true. The third shift is in how you hold the contradiction. You can find social media performative and still be kind to people who use it without your reservations. You can choose not to post without building a private identity around not posting. You can be private without making privacy a form of superiority. And you can want to be known, genuinely, deeply known, without that want making you feel like you failed at the self-sufficiency you've spent years carefully constructing. The contradiction doesn't need to be resolved, it just needs to be held a little more lightly. Your silence is not the absence of something. It never was. Think about what it actually is.
It's the capacity to be in a moment without immediately converting it into content. It's the ability to know someone well without needing them to know you're paying attention. It's a fidelity to your own experience that refuses to compromise for the sake of an audience, which, in a world that's increasingly difficult to experience without performing, is genuinely rare. The people who move through life quietly, who watch more than they announce, who feel more than they show, they carry an unusual kind of beauty. Not the beauty that gets documented or shared or celebrated on a feed, the kind that exists in the quality of their attention, in the depth of their loyalty, in the way a room slightly changes when they leave it, even if no one could say exactly why. Your trait doesn't disappear. It transforms from something that looked like absence into something that, seen clearly, is a form of profound and patient presence. The world has always needed people who watch it carefully, who hold its details with care, who remember what others forget, who can be trusted with the unperformed version of things. You are one of those people. The world just hasn't built a like button for what you offer, and maybe, in some quiet way, that's exactly the point. If you've made it to the end of this video, there's a good chance something here landed in a way that surprised you, either because it described you more accurately than you expected, or because it described someone you love and finally gave you a language for something you'd never quite been able to name. Take a moment before you scroll past to leave one word in the comments, just one, the word that best describes how you relate to social media: observer, ghost, watcher, quiet, selective, invisible, private, or something else entirely. You don't have to explain it, just one word. Sometimes that's enough to make someone else in the comments feel a little less alone in a very specific way. And if this video found you at a moment when you needed it, when you were starting to wonder whether something was wrong with you for not wanting to perform your life for an audience, share it with the one person in your life who also watches more than they post, who gives more attention than they ask for, who is known by far fewer people than deserve to know them. They'll understand why you thought of them.